So back to my favorite book, The Rancher's Wedding by Diana Palmer, and we're on chapter 6, so page 97. J.L. scowled. She looked guilty, and he wondered why. She thought for a minute. I had a job as an assistant to a producer at a television station north of Atlanta, she said finally. It wasn't quite the truth, but it sounded better than confessing she'd been a top writer for one of the most successful network weekly shows in the country. She didn't dare admit, because he might have heard about the scandal that involved her family. Assistant producer? He asked. It's like being a research assistant, she continued. I had all sorts of assignments, and I didn't have to sit at a desk all day. Once I got to do a feature story all by myself, with just a cameraman and a sound man with me in the van. One of her friends had such a job, and she was able to recall what the other woman had told her about the assignment she got. It was like being a reporter, but with a television camera instead of a pad and a pen, or more recently a notebook computer. It sounds complicated, she laughed. It's not. I covered news stories occasionally too, but it was mostly feature stuff. We have a weekly paper here in Benton, he said. In fact, the editor used to work in New York City. Her heart stopped beating. She just sat there and stared at J.L., vaguely horrified. Oh? She asked. Recently? No, he said, wondering all at the sudden paleness of her face. About 10 years ago. Are you okay? You look wan. I'm still weak, she said. She smiled. 10 years ago was a relief. The weekly editor wouldn't know about her father. I guess you are. I still feel bad that I let you get chilled like that. You made up for it, she told him. It's okay. He sipped more coffee. What I was getting at is that maybe you'd be happier working on the newspaper than waiting tables, he said hesitantly. I couldn't go back to it, she replied. The stress would be too much. It's just a weekly paper, not a daily, he teased. You don't understand. The stress on a weekly is much more worse than a daily paper. On a weekly, you're expected to do all sorts of things besides just report. On a daily, you just write your copy, turn it in, and sit to the editor or the state news editor. Oh. Besides, I like being a waitress, she said, grinning. Almost anybody can be a waitress with the right training, but it takes more than just training to be a reporter. Thanks, she said softly, searching his dark eyes. You're wasted is what I mean. She sighed. It's not stressful, what I do now, and I love the people I work with, she said. Besides, I don't have to sleep with a pistol underneath my pillow at night. What? He exclaimed. Back when I worked for the newspaper, we had this reporter, Barney. He did a story about corruption in the county commission and ticked off most of the members of the one community family. He got death threats. He slept with a pistol under his pillow. He was ran off the road one night and even hit a telephone pole. The perp was never caught. And Barney just decided he liked his work in a happier place, so he got a job as a telephone lineman. She chuckled. He said it was a lot less stressful. He laughed too. I guess so. I never thought of reporting as dangerous. It can be, depending on who you tick off, she replied. Did you ever get a death threat? He asked easily. She felt that question to the soles of her feet. She looked hunted, suddenly haunted. Yes, she confessed, once or twice. It had been a lot more than once or twice. She and her parents all had death threats from people who supported the conniving woman who wanted her father's job. Social media had hounded them to the point of madness, cost her mother her life. It was unreal how much damage people could do with just words. He frowned as he saw how upset she became. His big hand slid over her cold one and curled around it. Sorry, he said gently. You were thinking about your mother, weren't you? He amazingly was perceptive. She took a deep breath and had to fight a cough. Yes, I was, she confessed. Sorry. I didn't think, he said apologetically. I know it must be a hard thing to get over. Losing a parent is painful. Something we both know, she agreed, her fingers curled around his. It's still fresh. Life goes on, he replied softly. It has to. She nodded. She felt choked inside. He squeezed her fingers and let go. I've got to go, he said. We've got storm warnings for tonight. The boys and I have to bring a few remaining expectant mothers to the shelters near the house. Calves are hard on heifers that are bred for the first time. I can imagine. I never did get to see the calves, she added suddenly. Next time, he said softly, and smiled. She smiled back, her heart in her throat. Next time, she agreed. Just friends, he added firmly, even though he was feeling something that was definitely stronger than friendship. Just friends, she agreed perthily. I have already told you that I have to climb Mount Everest before I can even think about marrying anybody. He chuckled. I'll remember that. He stood up and put his hat on. You stay warm. I'm still on call if you need me. Don't go to work if there's ice on the road, and call Mary and tell her you can't get out. She has 2 other workers who live in town who can fill in if they have to. His protective attitude made her feel warm inside. Okay, she said softly. And don't go out of this house unless it catches on and don't go out of the house unless the house catches on fire, he said firmly. She laughed. I won't. He tilted his hat over one eye. I'll be back by tomorrow just to check in. Okay, I'll have coffee ready. Oh, wait, she called as he started for the door. She handed him the pan of rolls. 3:50, 16 minutes, she repeated. He smiled slowly. I won't forget. I'll see you later. See ya. She watched him walk out the door with her emotions boiling over inside of her. He said they'd just be friends, but there had been that look in his dark eyes that made her giddy, even in memory. They were building something wonderful. Her face fell. Something false. Because he didn't know the truth about her and her father. What would he feel if he found out? Would he believe the lies that people had told her dad? Would he even listen and if she tried to explain? She bit her lower lip hard. She didn't know what to do. In fact, there was nothing she could do unless she wanted to tell him the truth right now. That was unwise. If he wasn't sympathetic and he told anybody, the media might be able to find them out here and start persecution all over again. There would be no place left to go except maybe overseas, and they didn't have enough money for that anymore. She poured herself another cup of coffee and turned off the pot, her face drawn with worry. Life had seemed so simple when she and her dad moved here. It was small community and they'd blend in. Nobody would know them. It would be fine. Except that life was never static. You meet new people and get involved with them, even superficially. Then you were a hostage to fate. Anybody might suddenly see a news item on TV and connect it with a new man at the equipment store or the waitress at the restaurant. It wasn't likely, but it was possible, and her father could be recognized even out here. Then what would they do? She drew in a long, painful breath. Life was becoming more complicated all the time. She wanted to get closer to J.L., but he didn't want a serious relationship. And even if he did, how would she tell him the truth? She sipped her coffee and put the worry back out of her mind. She had lived one day at a time. It was no good anticipating trouble. That only made things worse. One day at a time, she told herself firmly. J.L. went home with the snow falling softly on the back roads and on the tall, sharp peaks of the surrounding mountains. He grimaced as he thought what a time they were going to have if the snow amounted to more than an inch or two. He was short-handed. 2 of his cowboys had quit with no apparent reason. He was still trying to replace them and not having much luck. It put more strain on the other workers trying to absorb the overflow of the routine task. Pregnant cows, especially purebred ones, required a lot of work. No rancher could afford to lose many calves in this economy. It meant checking on the herd several times a day to make sure they were sheltered, fed, and watered, and safe from predators. He thought about Two Toes and grimaced. That old wolf would be lounging in the tree line waiting for his chance at another little lost calf. Just the thought of it made him irritated. He parked the truck at the front door, went inside, and pulled out his cell phone. He had Butch Matthews, the wildlife rehabilitator, on the phone seconds later. There was a long pause while he outlined his problems with the resident bad boy of the wolf variety. Only 2 toes? Butch mused. Only 2. Well, one on one foot, that is, and we can tell that much by tracking him through the snow. He limps. He's also old, and he also must be missing some teeth because he only wants to bring down the little calves. I may be able to do something about that, Butch began. I don't want him killed, J.L. said at once. There was a deep laughter. Neither do I. I have a special regard for them. A wolf once saved my life. J.R. frowned. You're kidding. I'm not, Butch replied. I fell off my horse, rolled down a ravine, broke my leg. Somewhere along the line, my cell phone was torn out of its carrier. I had no way to get help. I heard a howling close by. A big white wolf wandered up. It was old and grizzled and looked hungry. I thought my number was up. It wasn't. The animal came close, sniffed my leg, looked at me, and lumbered off. A couple hours later, the wolf came back, sniffed my leg again, huffed, and trotted off. Not long after that, 2 men on horseback rode down the ravine to where I was. They made a makeshift travois of a lodgepole, pine trunks lashed together with rope, and topped the spare rain slicker They got me back to their ranch, called an ambulance on the way there. I was barely conscious and in a lot of pain. But I remember calling it a miracle that they found me before I was buried in the snow. One of them laughed and said the damn wolf led them to me. They were riding along the fence line to check on pregnant heifers when the wolf came up to them and just sat down and stared at them. They moved toward him, and he moved off a little distance. He sat right back down and stared at him once some more. They finally got the idea he wanted them to follow him. They did, and they found me. He laughed. That happened 8 years ago, and people still tell that story. In retrospect, it really was something of a miracle. I guess so. I don't guess you ever saw that wolf again, J.L. asked curiously. Not yet, but I might. That wolf saved my life, and a track of men followed, a unique track. The front left paw only had 2 toes. Son of a gun, J.L. exclaimed. I'm getting cold chills down my spine, he chuckled. Me too, so no worries on how we'll cope with the old fella. He can come live with me. I'll feed him venison and turkey and let him watch TV with me. I'll buy him a doggy bed, J.L. promised. Would be a great not to have any more savage calves. They are only predators, he was reminded, and it's still mostly winter here. There are other predators, he was reminded, and it's still mostly winter here. I know, but most predators aren't quite as smart as that old wolf. So it would seem. I'll be around tomorrow after lunch, if that's okay, and I'll bring a live trap with me. Good job. I'll expect you, and thanks. My pleasure. J.L. hung up the phone. Well, that was a story he'd enjoy telling Parker and Drum, and maybe even Cassie as well. A few days later, he drove out to town and picked up Cassie after work to show her the growing calf crop. How about your wolf? She asked curiously. Now there's a story and a half, he chuckled, and he related the story that Butch Matthews had told him. But you're going to lure him into a trap? She asked, aghast. A live trap. She just stared at him. It's called a humane trap. You put bait in there and wait for the animal to walk in. There's a spring that closes the gate and traps him inside, unharmed. Oh, she hesitated. But what if you don't go back to check on the trap and he starves to death? He shook his head with an affectionate smile. Oh, tender heart, he teased. She sighed. I guess I am. It wasn't a complaint. Butch checks the trap every few hours, he added. He's staying with us until 2 Toes cooperates. What is he going to do with an old wolf when he traps him? She asked worriedly. Take him home and feed him venison stew. Don't tease, she said gently. I'm not. He's going to take him home and feed him venison stew. Butch is the wildlife rehabilitator I told you about. He loves wolves. He had another one that was injured and couldn't release him to the wild. It lived for him for 6 years. He grieved for a long time after that. 2 Toes will be good for him. I see. That's not what I expected, she confessed and laughed self-consciously. Not what I expected either, he laughed. We usually trap animals like that and then take them far into the mountains and release them. We can't do that to 2 Toes because he'd starve. He hasn't caught him yet? He shook his head. 2 Toes is wily. He's hard to fool. I can see why. He sounds very intelligent. Like some dogs, J.L. agreed. We had a shepherd dog here a few years back as a guard dog. He understood most of what you told him. And whole sentences, not just random words. You could tell him to go into another room and get a particular toy. He'd bring it right back. And he'd do it. He sighed. Never had another dog as smart as him. What happened to him? She asked. He belonged to Drum, my foreman. Drum's girlfriend loved the dog to death and phoned every day to find out how he was. And when they broke up, in the end, Drum gave him to her. He said she grieved herself to death if he didn't. Poor Drum, she said. The dog was happy with her, he replied. She took him everywhere with her. In fact, her next boyfriend didn't like him, so she got rid of the boyfriend. He laughed. Tickled Drum to death. Think she might come back to him? Anything's possible, but he's had several girlfriends. Women love him. He's just not easily lassoed. He likes to be being himself. He doesn't mix well with other people. His girlfriend was making long-term plans, and it spooked him. He said he wasn't ready for all that. All that? She wondered. Picket fences, kids, dinner at home, no more poker on Friday night with the boys, that sort of thing. Maybe it's just as well, she said. I think it takes a lot of work to keep a couple together. My mom and dad loved each other very much, but even they had arguments and threatened to split up over every so often. They compromised. So did my parents. Besides that, both of them were kind-natured. They never went out of their way to hurt each other like some couples do today. I think compromise and tolerance are key parts of a good relationship. I do too. He glanced at her a little concerned. I haven't climbed Mount Everest yet, she said abruptly, and without looking at him. He burst out laughing as he got the reference about what she was planning when she planned to get married. Stop reading my mind. Stop thinking about absurd things, she shot right back. He just shook his head. They had a pasta salad and fruit for lunch, courtesy of J.L.'s housekeeper, Bessie. The older woman was overweight and abrupt, but she had kind eyes, and she seemed to approve of Cassie on sight. Heard you got sick, she said, as she poured the hot coffee into their mugs as they sat at the table. Chest infection, Cassie replied. I have asthma, so I'm prone to them. Had a grandma who was like that, the housekeeper said. She put the coffee pot up. Back in a sec, she said as she ambled down the hall. This is wonderful coffee, Cassie mentioned to J.L. Bessie likes it strong. So do I, he said. Bessie was back in a minute with a long, heavy wool coat. She draped it over the back of an empty chair beside Cassie. That belonged to my daughter, she told Cassie. You wear that when you go out in the cold with him, she indicating J.L. Colorado is no place for a lightweight coat, she added with a kind smile. Cassie's pride throbbed, but she bit her tongue. Thanks, she said huskily. Thanks so much. Bessie patted her gently on the back. It's no problem taking care of nice folks, she replied. Cassie was fighting tears, and the woman had a big heart. J.L. saw those glistening eyes, and he smiled tenderly. That's what we're both doing, he added, taking care of nice folk. Thanks, she said softly. Eat up, he said. A full belly makes traveling easier. Are we traveling then? She asked as she blinked away the tears and dug into her pasta salad. We are, to see the calves. Oh, boy, she enthused. He laughed out loud at her enthusiasm. We've got a good crop this year, he told her. Lucky for us that we only had an inch or two of snow. The spring grass will pop up soon, just in time to feed the new babies. I can't wait to. The ringing of his phone interrupted her. It was playing a theme song of a popular new movie. She grinned as she recognized it. He winked at her and he answered it. Yes? Oh, hi, Butch, he added. How's it going? Yes, I remember. Yes, his eyebrows arched. You did? When? He paused. Sure, I can send Drum. I'll come myself. The three of us should be able to get him in the truck without any issues. We can go home with you if you think. Okay. Well, you know, Wolf's better than any of us. Sure, about 10 minutes. We'll see you there. He hung up. He got 2 toes, he told Cassie and Bessie, who were both waiting to hear what was said. Hooray, Bessie broke out. Peace and quiet at last. We hope, J.L. chuckled. Are you going to go see him? Can I come? Cassie asked at once. He scowled, a little concerned. Please, she added, and her blue eyes pinned his and pleaded with him. He drew in a breath. It might be risky. It won't be, she said with certainty. I'll stay back and do what I'm told, please. He was remembering how she panicked when the wolves had crossed their path the day she got sick. It was because they came up so suddenly, she said, puzzling Bessie, who didn't know what happened that day. It wasn't the wolves, honest. Okay, then, but you got your rescue inhaler with you? She pulled it out of her pocket and showed it to him. All right, you can come. She grinned and grabbed the coat Bessie had brought out for her. Butch Matthews was waiting for them at the edge of the section of the lodgepole pines with the snow-covered peaks of the mountains for a backdrop. A tall, lanky man, he was leaning up against a truck with his arms folded. That was when Cassie bundled up Bessie's daughter's warm wool coat, noticed that the one of his arms was artificial. That would explain why he didn't lift the wolf into the truck by himself. She noticed something else when she looked past him at the trap. The wolf was twice the size of a large dog. He was huge. He was prone in the cage, just looking at the approaching humans without howling or making a noise of any kind. Has he been like this all this time? J.L. asked, puzzled, as they approached the cage. Yep, Butch Matthews said with a grin. Never tried to bite me even when I gave him some jerky and a little water. I think he remembers me, he added, and took a minute to explain the remark to Cassie, who was fascinated by the story he told. J.L. was staring intently at the huge wolf. I never get tired of looking at him, he said quietly. They're magnificent creatures. I hate losing calves to 'em, but it isn't malicious what they do. They're hungry, and when they find food, they just eat it. Except when they're old and their teeth are rotten and they can't half see. What? J.L. asked. This old pet is just about as blind, J.L., Butch said, indicating 2 toes. His eyes are milky as if he's got cataracts. I'm going to get one of those wildlife service people to look him over and make sure, but I don't think he can see much. He must have been going on smell alone to even find a calf." "What a shame," J.L. said. "Left in the wild, he would die." "He would. He could easily fall off the side of a sheer cliff without being able to see where he's going. Starvation would probably be a better bet. I don't anticipate much argument over getting to keep him," he grinned, "except he might have to listen to TV instead of watching it with me." "He's so pretty," Cassie said involuntarily. "I've never seen wolves that were that big." "Most people don't. If they've never seen one in person, Native Americans have all sorts of legends about them. I've read some of those," she confessed. She was a newspaper reporter, J.L. told his friend. "Really?" Butch asked. "That must be a high-pressure job." "It was," she said. "I don't do it anymore, but if I did, what a feature story Two Toes would make," she added with a sigh. "Feel free to interview me any time you like," Butch said with a twinkle in his eyes. "I can tell you plenty of stories about wildlife that you'll never read in a book." "I might take you up on that sometime," she said, but not with any great enthusiasm. In fact, she moved just a little closer to J.L., although she smiled at Butch. J.L. felt oddly protective when she did that. He slid his arm over her shoulder and drew her close. He smiled down at her. "She's soft-hearted," he said gently. "She was afraid we were going to kill Two Toes." "We'd never do that," Butch laughed. "He's so well known around these mountains that they'd probably ride us out of town on the rail if we even talked about it." "People know about him?" she exclaimed. "Sure they do," J.L. answered. "Benton's so small that and thrives on gossip, Two Toes is a great conversation starter. People have spotted him all around on government land, private land. He's just recognizable." "But can't they see him from a distance, that he just has two toes on one foot, can they?" she began. They both laughed. "That's not why. Come over here," Butch invited, and positioned himself right in front of the wolf. She joined him with J.L. and caught her breath. "Well, for heaven's sake!" she exclaimed. The big wolf was snow white, except for a gray ruff around his neck, but that was where he was most distinctive. His dark gray head had several white streaks, though as if he had had fur dyed in a unique pattern. "As you see," Butch continued, "he isn't that hard to recognize even at a distance. There isn't another wolf anywhere around with that particular coloring." "He really is unique," Cassie said softly, staring at the big animal. It turned its head and looked at her. It made an odd woofing sound, and then he whined. It cocked its head at her and sniffed. She was fascinated. Without asking, she went closer to the cage, very slowly, dropped down to one knee beside it. "Pretty boy," she said softly. "Sweet old wolf." He whined again and lowered his head to look up at her with the big, pale, milky brown eyes. She reached into the cage slowly and rubbed her fingers over his head between his eyes. He whined again and sighed, making no move to bite or snap at her. "Animals like you, miss," Butch remarked. She laughed softly. "I've always had dogs," she said. "Well, until the past few months," she added sadly. "My last dog was very old. He developed cancer and we had to put him down." "They can treat that, but it's massively expensive," Butch said. "Massively," she agreed, not adding that she had the dog given chemotherapy in hopeless effort to prolong his life. Finally, her father had convinced her that she was only adding to the animal's suffering. There was no hope of recovery. She gave in. Even the vet said it was the kindest thing to do. "I still miss him," she added gently. "What sort of dog was he?" J.L. asked. She smiled. "A Malamute," she replied. "In Georgia?" J.L. exclaimed. She laughed. "Well, we had air conditioning, you know, although one day I came home from work and found him sitting inside the refrigerator. He opened the door right after the air conditioner apparently failed." She shook her head. "It was a mess to clean up." He just laughed, she added, recalling the dog's happy expression. "I had a Malamute and a Siberian Husky once," J.L. said. "They're great pets. Lousy watchdogs." "I know," she laughed out loud. "If you were ever robbed, they'd follow the burglars around and show 'em with the best stuff and help them carry it outside to their getaway car. At least Ranger would have," she added. "But they're great company." "Yes," she agreed. "Ranger would sit outside with me on nights when we had meteor showers and just lie down and be quiet the whole time, sometimes for hours." "You like meteor showers?" J.L. asked. "I love 'em." "So do I." She got to her feet. "Good luck, old fellow," she told Two Toes. "He won't need luck. He's got Matthews," J.L. chuckled. "Well, if you'll need any help to get him loaded up," Butch began. A pickup truck pulled off the road and parked next to JL's SUV. A tall, powerfully built man with long hair, black hair, and a somber face joined them. "Caught him, I hear," he asked. "Caught him. Hey, Parker," Butch greeted, shaking the newcomer's hand. "I could use a little help." "No problem." Parker walked over to the cage, knelt beside it, and passed something into the cage for the wolf. He patted it on the head and said something else, and he got to his feet without asking for assistance, picked up the cage and slid it on the bed of the pickup truck all by himself. He put up the tailgate and secured it in place. "I didn't see that," Butch said. "I didn't see that either," JL added. "I lift weights," Parker said, glaring at them. "You could do it, too, if either of you went to the gym." "Wouldn't do me much good," Butch sighed, indicating that his mechanical arm was but smiling as if making light of his disability. "Wouldn't now," Parker agreed, "but you couldn't have lifted him before you lost that arm, Matthews," he added with a grin. "I guess not. I just hate gyms, nasty, smelly places," Butch said, making a face. "Well, he won't build me a gym," Parker said, jerking his thumb at JL, "so I don't have much choice now, do I?" "Why should I build you a gym?" he asked the tall man. "Because I can break horses like nobody else who works for you, and mostly I wouldn't have to go to town where there are nasty smelling gyms, wandering gangs of panting women." Cassie blinked. "Excuse me?" "Panting women," Parker said, turning his twinkling black eyes and infectious grin on her. "Every time I take my shirt off to work out, I have to fend 'em off with a shield. A man with my great assets get harassed all the time by women." "You should sue," JL said with a straight face. "Absolutely," Butch agreed, "or at least take me with you to the gym so I can take the overflow." Parker chuckled. "I might take you up on that. Thanks for the help, Butch." "No problem, Sarge," he replied. "I still owe you for the last deployment in Iraq." "Yeah, well, I owe you a couple of favors, too," came the reply. Cassie sensed the affection between the two men and wondered at it. Parker threw up his hand and went back to his own truck. Butch thanked JL again, got into his truck, and drove away, leaving Cassie and JL alone. "Why did he call Mr. Matthews Sarge?" she asked. "That's a long story," he replied. "I'll tell it to you on the way to see the calves." "Isn't Mr. Parker the man that you said you had to keep away from people because he cussed so much?" she asked. "He is." "But he didn't cuss a single time," she pointed out. "Must have had a fever or something," he teased. "Really?" she laughed. "Were he and Mr. Matthews both in Iraq?" "They were. Butch was his sergeant. They got into a firefight with insurgents, and Butch was badly wounded. Parker dodged through a hail of gunfire to get him, threw him over his shoulder, dodged back behind our own line, and he was hit twice before he got hit there." "A brave man," she said solemnly. "Very brave. Butch lost his arm, but kept his life. Later on, he returned the favor by taking out an insurgent who sneaked up into the camp and had an automatic trained on Parker. Butch shot that man and saved Parker's life." "I begin to understand," she said. He nodded. "Combat makes fast friends of strangers." She searched his hard face. "Were you over there, too?" she recalled. He nodded. "I was in a different outfit than Butch, but Parker was there too, but in the general vicinity." She recalled that he never talked about it, so she didn't push. He noticed that. He loved that about her. Most women would have tried to pry it out of him, become insistent. She didn't. She just accepted people the way they were. He did wonder at Parker. The man was notorious for his blistering political incorrect vocabulary, yet he said not one bad word in front of Cassie's company. He was going to ask about that later. It was a real mystery. Meanwhile, he took Cassie to the barn and walked her down the wide paved aisle to the stalls where there was 3 calves that were kept. "These little ones have been sick," he told her, "so we brought 'em here." He didn't add that taking her out in the pasture to see the calves could be dangerous. He didn't run, pulled, or dehorn cattle, and mother cows could be dangerous if perceived a threat from human intruders. He didn't see one cow actually attack one of his cowboys for petting a calf on the head. That particular cow had been culled, and it wasn't wise to keep an aggressive animal around his cowboys. But sometimes you didn't get a cow that was aggressive until you found out the hard way. He was not going to risk Cassie. Pulled cattle were less dangerous around cowboys and equipment, but in an area with predators like JL's ranch it was more profitable to leave the horns on, so that the cattle could defend themselves, especially with the big snows that made it difficult for workers to get to them. "They're so pretty," Cassie remarked, leaning on the fence, smile over at the calves. "Black as coal." He nodded. "Will they get better?" He laughed. "Sure they will. They'll go back to the herd and be with their moms." "I read those that some mothers reject their calves. Then what do you do?" They become bottle calves, he said simply. We bring 'em into the barn and feed 'em and keep 'em here until they're weaned. We always have a few of 'em. That's sad. That's life, he replied easily. Sometimes mothers don't know what to do with their calves, especially first-time moms. They walk away and can't find them again, or just walk away, period. We check the herd several times a day during the calving, so we find 'em, and if they're by themselves. Usually, sometimes we have problems, like old Two-Toes raiding our pastures. I like your Mr. Matthews, she said. He's nice. He chuckled. He liked it the way she described his friend. He found over the years that women who thought men were nice didn't feel much attraction to them, except as substitute brothers. It pleased him that Matthews hadn't made an impression. Not that he was interested in her in that way. Of course he wasn't. On the other hand, Parker had been very interested in her. He'd never seen a man so animated. Mr. Parker lifted that whole cage into the truck by himself, she added worriedly. I hope he didn't hurt himself. I imagine Two-Toes is very heavy. He's a big wolf. Parker frequently amazes us, he replied. We don't know a lot about his background. He never speaks of it. We only know that about Iraq because Matthews was in his unit. Mr. Parker looks sort of different, she replied. He laughed. He's part Crow. She nodded. Yes, one of Custer's scouts was part Lakota. Mitch Boyer, who died with him at the Little Bighorn, his best friend was Thomas LaForge, who wrote a book entitled Memoirs of the White Crow Indian. He lived with the Crow people. It was a fascinating book. He knew his jaw had dropped. She glanced at him. She laughed. I love that period of history, she explained. I've read everything I could find on the Battle of Little Bighorn, including eyewitness accounts by the Native Americans who fought there. Isn't it amazing, she added, that people of that period said there was no eyewitnesses left alive, and there were literally hundreds of Native Americans of many tribes who fought in that battle. I know what you mean, he said. It was a particularly sad period in our history. She nodded. It was painful to look too deeply into those fights, but I had a history professor who told me that we should never judge the past by the mortality of the present. You have to judge by the mortality of the time period, and that's never easy. We learn as we grow, he agreed. Our time period isn't perfect, but we're a hell of a lot better than we were a century ago. She smiled. I think that, too. I always loved history, he remarked. I studied it in the military. Dad wanted me to go into law school, but I needed business courses to keep companies operating in the black. I majored in business, minored in economics and marketing. Cassie had majored in history, but she wasn't going to mention it. He might wonder why a woman who'd gone to college was waiting tables. Dad said that you deal more in oil than you do in cattle, she said. That's true. I inherited the cattle, but I made a fortune in the oil. By speculating, taking chances, he replied, chuckling. I've never taken a chance in my life, she murmured. Actually, she had, by coming out west incognito with her dad. I never used to. Then I went into the army, he sighed and shook his head. My dad and I fought it out because he wanted me to go to college first, and I wanted experience. He glanced at her. I got my way. Wished I hadn't, too. I heard all those stories about combat, about how noble it was. He laughed. It had a hollow sound. I had a buddy, Rick. We went through basic training together, ended up in the same company. We both came from rural backgrounds, and we pretty much agreed on life, politics, so we spent our liberties together. His eyes had a faraway look as he stared over the fence at the little calves, as if he really wasn't seeing them. We shipped out to Iraq. We were slated for an insurgent into the enemy territory to take care of some of the insurgents who were standing off and taking pot shots at us. He drew a long breath. It wasn't until we closed in on them that I noticed one man was drawing back to throw something. Before I could say a word, Rick went up in the air as if he'd been tossed by a giant hand. He had died instantly. Oh my gosh, she said softly. The insurgents moved up behind the grenade-tossing front man. We had to call in reinforcements before we could recover our casualties, he winced. There wasn't a lot of Rick left. She slid her hand out over his where it rested on the gate. His fingers curled around it. She could feel the tension in him. So that was my introduction to noble art of war. There's nothing noble about it. There's fear, terror, grief, and blood. He smothered his hands over hers. I took a round in the shoulder, fortunately not a fatal one, and got sent home because I was so close to being discharged. So Dad finally got his way. Almost 4 years later, I did go to college after all. She laughed softly. I'm sure your dad was happy about that. Until I fought overseas, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep the ranch, he said, surprising her. But when I came home and settled back in, the very peace of it was comforting. Animals and people depending on me needed me. He shrugged. It was a new concept. I got used to it. I used to take care of Mama when she was sick, she said. She never asked me to. She was always trying to convince me that she could take care of herself, even when she couldn't. She was a sweet, kind person, and it wasn't right what happened to her. I still think you have a potential lawsuit there, he said. It's like my father said, we aren't that sort of people, she said, heading off trouble. There was no way she could bring a lawsuit without going back east and blowing her cover. It would bring the weight of the media right back down on them all over again. He looked at her with affection. You feel things deeply, don't you? She nodded. My dad always said that I was too sensitive to live in the real world, that I take things hard. Like ignorant men making fun of you for being overly dramatic when you're gasping for breath, he said with a wry smile. Oh, I didn't blame you, she said, looking up into his soft brown eyes. I'm sure it looked like I was overreacting. I should have known better, he replied. He brushed her disheveled red gold hair with a gloved hand. You hold things inside. I never wanted to worry Mama, so I had to. She was even more sensitive than I am, she sighed. I miss her. You still got your dad. Yes, my biggest blessing. He has a very cultured voice, he said abruptly. I don't think I've ever heard one quite like it, except for radio announcers. I don't guess he ever worked for radio stations? She laughed and tried to make it sound natural. No, I've always thought that he had that voice for it, too. What did he do before he came out here? He was a businessman, she said. He worked for a corporation that marketed commodities. It had, she rationalized, it marketed entertainment. And here he is in Benton, Colorado, selling farm and ranching equipment, he observed. It's an honest living, she told him. At least he isn't holding up convenience stores to swipe chicken burritos. She recalled the last item from the movie she loved, Battleship, and she burst out laughing. He looked down at her with a long, howling amusement. There was this movie. Yes, she laughed. They ended up fighting aliens in a World War II battleship aided by a former crew. It's one of my favorites, he confessed. Mine too, and nobody in my whole family was ever in the Navy. My people are all Army, by the way, through all the wars. He laughed. My family was strictly Marines. I won't hold it against you, she said with a wicked grin. He sighed and shook his head. I knew you'd be one of those the first time I saw you, he mused. One of those? Madcap people, he explained. Outrageous and funny. Thanks, I think. Oh, it's a compliment, he said, turning back toward the aisle. I tend to like outrageous people. So do I, she said, and she fell into step beside him. Do you like superhero movies? Love 'em. How about cartoon movies? He stopped halfway down the aisle and turned to her. Cartoon movies? Mona, she said, Lilo and Stitch, How to Train Your Dragon, Despicable Me. Oh, those, he chuckled. I don't watch many of them. I did watch Mona. We had a guy from New Zealand who worked there when it came out, a Maori. He dragged us all to the theater to see it. He was right. It was spectacular. Besides, he added, it had The Rock. The what? The Rock, he repeated. Don't tell me you've never watched wrestling. Dwayne Johnson, she exclaimed. That Rock. He grinned. Yes, that Rock. Isn't he awesome? She sighed. He could stand on stage and read a telephone directory and I'd buy a ticket. He's just gorgeous. Women do love him, but men admire him because he's so accomplished, an athlete, an actor, and a very unusual combination. Dave Bautista's in the Guardians of the Galaxy, she pointed out. He was a wrestler too, and he's a terrific actor. Nice that we have the same ones, he returned, although we have to keep in mind that you haven't climbed Mount Everest. Oh, I always keep that in mind, she agreed. Do you have more calves? Lots, but they're out in pasture and I don't run polled cattle. She stopped and looked up at him, wide and curious blue eyes. They all have horns, he explained. So, he said, taking her gently by the shoulders. Mama cows are very protective of their babies, and some of them can be aggressive. We don't take chances, our guests will get hurt. I see. But there's still some bottled calves, he added. Her eyes lit up. Not today, he said, smiling. I have a business meeting in Dallas on Monday, and I have to get to the airport early in the morning, so I'll have time to talk to some other investors over the weekend. How about next Saturday? I'd love that, she said, her feelings spilling out of her like a foam on a latte. I would too, he replied. He smiled. I'll pick you up about noon and Bessie can fix us lunch. She grimaced. Saturday I have to work. Sunday, he amended. She nodded. Sunday's fine. I never mentioned how good those rolls were that you made me, he said. Drum came in to ask a question, smelled the air, and promptly grabbed 3 of them and took them with him. They were delicious. I'm glad you like them, she said, feeling warm inside. What would you like from Texas, he asked. A longhorn, she ventured. He gave her a long-suffering look. Something that I can get on an airplane. Peanuts. That took him a minute. He burst out laughing. Hell, I'll bring you something unexpected. Okay, she said, grinning up at him. He was still laughing when he dropped her off at home. He drove away feeling new, reborn. It was as if the past few months hadn't even happened. He was already looking forward to next weekend. Did you have fun? Her father asked over supper. Lots, she replied. They caught the wolf who's been bringing down the calves. Oh, did? Did they shoot it? No, it's an old wolf, almost blind. So there's this local wildlife rehabilitator who's going to adopt it. That's nice. Not what I expected from ranchers, I have to confess, he added. JL's not your average rancher, she said. The rehabilitator only has one arm. He and this guy named Parker, who works for JL, were both overseas in combat. So was JL, I hear. She nodded. He talked about it just a little. He lost his best friend to a grenade. Damn shame what young men and women have to go through when they join the military, he replied. Not that I didn't try to join, he added ruefully, with a smile. I had a bad heart valve. I tried more than once, but they wouldn't let me in, he grimaced. The valve's still bad, and I've never had a minute's trouble from it. Go figure. Rules are rules. So they say. I'm going back over to the ranch for lunch next Sunday, she told him. I'll make sure you got something nice cooked before I go. His eyebrows lifted. Getting serious? Trying not to, she said. He isn't ready to get involved again, and I'm not sure we should. We've still got the scandal hanging over us. JL would think I've been deceptive because I didn't level with him about it and why we've been out here, but I can't risk telling him in case he let it slip. I can feel your pain. I'm in the same. I'm afraid to open my mouth. She's getting away with it all, she said angrily. It's not right. I've got Jake working on things back in Manhattan, he said unexpectedly. Your attorney? She asked, surprised. He nodded. He's asking questions. He thinks there may be a way to get her to confess. That would take a miracle, she said. Don't ever discount miracles, he said affectionately. Trudy Blaze has enemies, and one of them used to be a television producer right here in Los Angeles. He got fired for harassment, and she got his job. Why does that sound so familiar? She asked with biting sarcasm. And it may not be the only instance of malfeasance. People who also cause problems to get ahead generally use the same scheme over and over because it works. But it can be a deal breaker if it gets found out. Oh, how I hope it gets found out. Me too, he agreed. At least there's a little light at the end of the tunnel. All we have to do is be patient and wait for developments. Patience is hard, she said. I know, but we don't have much choice, he grimaced. I'm so sorry that I didn't see this coming. I'll never stop blaming myself for what happened to your mother. If it just given in at the very beginning. Don't do that, she told him firmly. Neither of us realized what she might do. She never told us about the scathing things people were saying to her on social media. She took those comments to heart and let them eat at her. What she did in a moment of depression and madness, it was an impulsive and that arose out of mental torment. We would have stopped her if we'd known, but she never said a word. She was like that, he recalled sadly, always putting other people first in everything. I just wish she would have told me. We can't go back, she replied. We have to go ahead, however difficult it is. I know, it's just... I miss her too, she said softly. He managed a smile. So do I. They watched the evening news on the little TV set with no real enthusiasm. One particular news item caught their attention and was just a quick note running across the bottom of the screen. On scrolling news items, it said that one or two writers on television program Cassie used to write for had met with a terrible accident on a snow-covered lane in Vermont where he was spending a week with his wife. He died instantly. Oh, poor Frank, she said, her face reflecting her sadness. He was one of the best writers we had. And poor Essa, his wife. They didn't have children. All they had was each other. She sighed, and her eyes was lowering to the floor. He patted her hand. It's rough, what we're going through. But you know what your mother would say. She nodded. She'd say that God had a plan, that we're all a part of it, and that one day we would realize why things happened the way they did. She was a fatalist. I'm sorry about Frank. Me too, she said as she glanced at the screen again and noticed that the commentator was speaking about the writer's death. The producers were laminating that their best writer, C.N. Reed, had given up quote-unquote his job. It was kept quiet, at least to the media, that C.N. Reed was, in fact, a woman. Everyone knows that the woman with obviously knew everyone who she worked with obviously knew that she was female. There was another news item about the Warlocks and Warriors series, that one that Cassie had written for, concerning its producer. He'd been accused of entertaining an underage girl at his apartment. Executives with the network were discussing whether or not to fire him. Trudy Blaze, they added, had been discussing as coming on board at the show. Gossip, that's what she might be taking a position, since the show she inherited was from a disgraced producer. Roger Reed was failing in ratings. Failing because she had a hand in it, Cassie said angrily. She's like poison. She spoils everything she touches. Amen, he said quietly. I'm sorry for your show, he added. She'll send it to the scrap heap if they give her that job. I can't understand why they would. It was an open secret that Mattley Butler liked younger women, she said, but he never entertained underage girls, and nobody ever accused him of anything, but Trudy could make a meal out of him. All she'd have to do is have someone trick him into a compromising situation and get photos of it to imply that his conquest was underage. The media would feed on that story and ignore anybody who tried to correct her lie, just like they did with you. She's sleeping with her attorney, and he has an investigator who's known for dirty tricks, she added. So I've heard. They listened again to the commentator. He was mentioning that a powerful network executive has stepped up to defend Mr. Reed and was adamant that he wasn't that sort of man to ever be indecent with any woman. He added that in flattering comment about Miss Blaze, who seemed to inherit a lot of jobs from executives who were found in compromising situations. Kind of him, Roger said quietly, but he's in the minority. Almost every executive on that network lined up to kick me out the door. They mentioned both of our names, Cassie said worriedly. He drew in a breath. We're safe out here, he assured her. Nobody will connect us with that scandal. We're living in one of the smallest towns in Colorado. They won't even look for us here. That's not what I meant, she said. What if somebody local sees that on TV and realizes it's us? They only used your initials, like they used on the show's credits. Yes, but my last name is Reed, and they gave your last name as well, she persisted. He smiled sadly. We'll have to hope that we don't get any connected with what happened in New York. She bit her lower lip. If J.L. sees it, he'll think that I've been lying to him this whole time about being poor and all. I don't think it would matter now, he replied. He smiled gently. He's sweet on you. Maybe he doesn't want to be, but I don't think that he'd walk away even if he knew the truth. She grimaced. I guess I can hope, can't I? Things will look up. I promise they will, he said. We just have to live it one day at a time, sweetheart. You're right. We both have to stop trying to live in the past. That's harder. Of course it is. She glanced at him. Are you really happy out here, Dad? He shrugged. It isn't as if I had a choice. Nobody in TV in New York would touch me after what I've been accused of. That producer who defended you might. Hartman Spencer, he said, smiling. He never believed Trudy in the first place. He called her a liar to her face. She just laughed. She'll get her comeuppance one of these days, she replied quietly. You just wait and see. Lies always get found out. Mostly. And that private detective may come up with something really nice to throw at her, especially if she's pulled that trick before. He nodded. We should have made her take you to court, she said suddenly. She'd have to prove those charges. She couldn't. During the time that she said you were assaulting her, you were at a meeting with the president of the film company for 2 of its directors. And the president might be willing to testify to that, but I promise you that the 2 directors would run for their lives. Nobody sane wants to be sucked into this mess. It's just not right that one person can make such an accusation and suddenly get 1 million people yelling for blood. I do agree, he said. He smiled. We've seen our share of them for sure. What we have to do is fight back, she replied, meeting his gaze. I don't know how to do it, and we don't have any money. My attorney got paid before I got fired, he said, so he's got the capital to pursue the case. A very wise decision on my part, I must say, considering I didn't know what was about to happen. I like your attorney. He reminds me of one of those old Perry Mason episodes I like to watch on YouTube. He does bear a certain resemblance to Raymond Burr, he chuckled. He has first editions and even an illuminated manuscript. Yes, he said. He could retire in Europe and live like a king on what he inherited, but he practices law. He's good at it, too. Mostly he takes cases that no other counselor will. She smiled. He's dishy, too, she teased. My secretary used to think so, too. He chuckled. She said it was a fortunate that she was married, because otherwise she'd lie down on that floor in his office and refuse to leave until he took her to dinner. She'd have a long wait from what I heard, she replied. He went through a bitter divorce. He said he'd never marry anybody again. He probably means it. He says that he was an investigator hot on the track with some vital information. He wouldn't tell me what it was. I hope it's coming from the investigation of Trudy. So do I. I would really hate to see her get away with what she did. Mama would still be alive but for her. We don't know that, he said unexpectedly. We're all living on borrowed time. If you think about it, we know all that we're all going to die eventually. We just don't know when and how. Maybe she was right, and there really is a plan that God has in store for us all. We die when we're supposed to. It's a kind way of looking at it, she said. I just wish... Yes, he interrupted, me too. Cassie didn't sleep much that night, remembering the horrible accusations that Trudy Blaze had thrown at her father in the news media. She made friends with a lonely reporter who had worked for a major news agency, and she fed him pitiful stories about that lecher Roger Reed had done to her. It was all an act, all for show. The woman pretended to cry, but there was no real tears, no red eyes, no sign of true misery. Trudy had lied, and it had cost Cassie's mother her life. She wasn't ready to talk about forgiveness, even if it was for her father. She wanted to nail the woman's reputation to a tree. She wanted revenge. But then she thought about how she wasn't telling J.L. the truth about her past. She sighed and worried about what he would think if he ever found out. She just prayed that he would understand, and it was not malicious that she had to hide the truth. Oh, goodness. Well, let's see. We're about done with this part of this. Well, we're about done with the book. But it's 3:16 at night. We'll have more time tomorrow. We will pick up on chapter 8. At least we got 2 chapters in tonight. Thank you. Now I'm trying to get this book read before Sunday so we can put it in with the books to go to the Candy Kitchen, because it's been a joy and a blessing, but it's time for it to be a joy and a blessing to someone else. Okay. I'm not going to sing tonight. I'll take a couple of some questions next instead. So stay tuned. I won't do my sign off just yet, but make sure you're staying tuned.